Alright, hey everyone, Simon here, and we are in Assassin's Creed Liberation. So we finished the game, and now it's time for the architecture tour. There's only one city here, which is New Orleans. We might actually look at Chichen Itza as well. But for now, let's look at New Orleans. This is the main city of the game. So we are standing in front of the church. That's the map of the city there. New Orleans, 1777. Right, so look at that. So on Google Maps, let me just so this is the United States, and if you don't know where New Orleans is, it's there. And the part of the map that is in the game is the French Quarter here. You see a roughly rectangular thing with a grid of streets. This is basically the French Quarter. So the old French city of New Orleans is here, and everything else is later on. And the church that we're standing in front of is right there. That thing there. Alright, so let us begin with the brief history of the city of New Orleans, at least until 1777, which is when the game takes place. Alright, so what do we have here? New Orleans is a major United States port and the largest city and metropolitan area in the state of Louisiana. The population of the city was 343,829 as of the 2010 US Census. The New Orleans metropolitan area had a population of 1.167 million in 2010 and was the 46th largest in the United States. So it's not really a big city, even in the United States. It's the 46th largest metropolitan area. The New Orleans Metairie Bogalusa Combined Statistical Area, a larger trading area, had a 2010 population of 1.452 million people. So it's not that many people. The city is named after the Duke of Orleans, who reigned as regent for Louis XV from 1715 to 1723, as it was established by French colonists and strongly influenced by their European culture. It is well known for its distinct French and Spanish Creole architecture. So French and Spanish Creole. Creole is kind of like a mix, or Creole is like it's like when a culture moves to a different part of the world, and it mixes with the natives, and creates a new distinctive sort of flavor of culture. So Creole basically means French and Spanish influenced, but distinctly New Orleans culture. That's what Creole means. As well as its cross-cultural and multilingual heritage. New Orleans is also famous for its cuisine, music, especially as the birthplace of jazz, and its annual celebrations and festivals, most notably Mardi Gras, dating back to French colonial times. The city is often referred to as the most unique in the United States. Well, I mean, it's French and Spanish, which is unlike most other cities in the United States. New Orleans is located in southeastern Louisiana, straddling the Mississippi River. The city and Orleans Parish are coterminous. The city and parish are bounded by the parishes of... I don't think we need to know about the boundaries of this place. Alright, and then Hurricane Katrina, if you remember that, pretty much flooded the old town. Alright, let's go to history. Wow, there's a main article. Or we're just going to stick with this article. So let's look at the history. La Nouvelle Orleans, New Orleans, was founded May 7th, 1718. So by the time of the game, the city has been in existence for about 60 years. Founded 1718 by the French Mississippi Company under the direction of Jean-Baptiste Lemonnier de Bienville. I hope I didn't mangle that too badly. On land inhabited by the Chitimacha. Wait. It was on land already inhabited by some Native Americans. That's crazy. It was named for Philippe d'Orléans, Duke of Orleans, who was regent of the Kingdom of France at the time. His title came from the French city of Orleans. So basically his name is Philip of Orleans. The French colony was ceded to the Spanish Empire in the Treaty of Paris, 1763. During the American Revolutionary War, New Orleans was an important port for smuggling aid to the rebels, transporting military equipment and supplies up the Mississippi River. Bernardo de Galvez y Madrid, Count of Galvez, successfully launched a southern campaign against the British from the city in 1779. Oh, that doesn't take place in the game. So it was because it was Spanish territory. The British couldn't do very much to stop the smuggling of weapons to the Revolutionary Army in the American Revolution. New Orleans remained under Spanish control until 1801, when it reverted briefly to French oversight. Nearly all of the surviving 18th century architecture of the Vieux Carré, or the French Quarter, dates from the Spanish period, the most notable exception being the old Ursuline convent. Fascinating. Almost all the existing architecture in the French Quarter was built during Spanish occupation or under Spanish control. So it's probably more like the Spanish Quarter than the French Quarter, right? Because it's built during the Spanish rule. Anyway, Napoleon sold Louisiana, New France, to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Thereafter, the city grew rapidly with influxes of American, French, Creoles, and Africans. Later immigrants were Irish, Germans, and Italians. Major commodity crops of sugar, cotton were cultivated with slave labor on large plantations outside the city. So all of these themes we actually visited during the game. So we had the rebels and the smuggling and the slavery, trying to free some slaves, and then so all of this stuff kind of plays into the theme of the game. Now that I'm reading this, I kind of wish the game made a better job of actually kind of talking about these themes in the game, because the story in the game was so sparse and so disjointed that they talk about these things, or you play through these quests, but you don't really get a sense of your place in history. You know what I mean? Like, you don't really get a sense of the factions and the power struggles and you as a black woman who's also an assassin and stuff like that. I mean, that's fictional, but at the very least, I wish they kind of conveyed the sense of history a bit better, because everything ties into the history. It's inspired by the history, but then you play through it and you don't get a sense of the history as you play through it. It's just like you're just doing stuff. Anyway, I'm just gonna extrapolating and trying to tell you why I dislike, or why I kind of partly disagree with how they handle the story. Anyway, let me continue reading. The Haitian Revolution ended in 1804 and established the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere, and the First Republic led by black people. Oh, this is Haiti, alright. It had occurred over several years in what was then the French colony of Saint-Dominique. Thousands of refugees from the revolution, both whites and free people of color, arrived in New Orleans, often bringing African slaves with them. While Governor Claiborne and other officials wanted to keep out additional free black men, the French Creoles wanted to increase the French-speaking population. As more refugees were allowed in Louisiana, Haitian immigrants who had first gone to Cuba also arrived. Many of the white francophones had been deported by officials in Cuba in retaliation for Bonaparte's schemes in Spain. Alright, so this is after the game, so we don't see any of this stuff, but when Haiti became independent and became a republic, a lot of refugees escaped and came to New Orleans, apparently, and then and then there's kind of problems with the existing slavery. I mean, they had slaves, they were whites, but they were also people of color who themselves had slaves. So but the white people in New Orleans wanted to keep out the free black men, but then the French Creoles wanted to introduce more French people in. So this is kind of, everybody had their own agenda. Nearly 90% of the immigrants settled in New Orleans. In 1809, migration brought 2,731 whites, 31, I mean, did I say that wrong? 2,731 whites, 3,102 free persons of African descent. So it's free Africans, free black people, and then 3,226 enslaved persons of African descent, doubling the city's population. The city became 63% black in population, a greater proportion than Charleston, South Carolina's 53%. So all of a sudden, in 1 year, the city's population doubled, and it became a lot of black people, both free blacks and slaves. This is so complicated. During the final campaign of the War of 1812, the British sent a force of 11,000 soldiers, marines, and sailors in an attempt to capture New Orleans. Despite great challenges, General Andrew Jackson, with support from the US Navy on the river, successfully cobbled together a motley military force of militia from Louisiana and Mississippi, including free men of color, US Army regulars, and a large contingent of Tennessee state militia, Kentucky riflemen, Choctaw fighters, and local privateers, the latter led by the pirate Jean Lafitte. So, so they had free black men, United States Army regulars, and militiamen, Native Americans, and pirates to decisively defeat the British troops. That is amazing. Led by Sir Edward Pakenham in the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. I wish that was in the game. That sounds exciting. That sounds a lot of fun. Native Americans and pirates and free blacks and American regulars, army regulars, and militiamen. How do you even organize that? The armies had not learned that the Treaty of Ghent had officially ended the war on December 24th, 1814. The fighting in Louisiana had begun in December 1814 and did not end until late January, after the Americans held off the British Navy during a 10-day siege of Fort St. Philip. The Royal Navy went on to capture Fort Boyer near Mobile before the commanders received news of the peace treaty. As a principal port, New Orleans played a major role during the antebellum era in the Atlantic slave trade. Its port also handled huge quantities of commodities for export from the interior and imported goods from other countries, which were warehoused and transferred in New Orleans to smaller vessels and distributed the length and breadth of the vast Mississippi River watershed. The river in front of the city was filled with steamboats, flatboats, and sailing ships. Despite its role in the slave trade, New Orleans at the time had the largest and most popular and prosperous community of free persons of color in the nation, who were often educated and middle-class property owners. That's amazing. I mean, it's kind of bad, but amazing at the same time. Like, it was the principal port, or was it the principal or one of the major ports of the slave trade? Because it's set on the Mississippi River, and it was kind of on the coast as well. So the ocean-going ships would come in, transfer cargoes to smaller boats going up the river, and then those boats would bring the goods back down the river and then put them back on the boats and then ship them back to Europe. So it was like a major port linking the river and the inland areas along the Mississippi River with the transatlantic trade. And that trade included slaves and, of course, all the stuff that the slaves produced, like cotton and other stuff. That's amazing, and it had the largest and most prosperous community of free persons of color. Despite the slave trade, there were also a lot of free blacks who also owned slaves, which is that's complicated, isn't it? Dwarfing in population the other cities in the antebellum South, New Orleans had the largest slave market in the domestic slave trade, which expanded after the United States ending of the international trade in 1808. Two-thirds of the more than 1 million slaves brought to the Deep South arrived via the forced migration of the domestic slave trade. The money generated by the sale of slaves in the Upper South has been estimated at 15% of the value of the staple crop economy. The slaves represented $500 million in property, and ancillary economy grew up around the trade in slaves for transportation, housing, and clothing, fees, etc., estimated at 13.5% of the price per person. All of this amounted to tens of billions of dollars, well, that tens of billions of 2005 dollars adjusted for inflation, during the antebellum period, with New Orleans as a prime beneficiary. So yeah, as the major trading port in the South, the slave trade was focused here as well. According to the historian Paul Lachance, the addition of white immigrants from Saint Dominique to the white Creole population enabled French speakers to remain a majority of the white population until almost 1830. If a substantial portion of free persons of color and slaves had not also spoken French, however, the Gallic community would have become a minority of the total population as early as 1820. So there's a lot of it's the city in the United States, but they all spoke, well, most of them spoke French. A lot of them were black, either slaves or free. After the Louisiana Purchase, numerous Anglo-Americans migrated to the city. The population of the city doubled in the 1830s, and by 1840, New Orleans had become the wealthiest and third most populous city in the nation. Large numbers of German and Irish immigrants began arriving in the 1840s, working as laborers in the busy port. In this period, the state legislature passed more restrictions on manumissions of slaves and virtually ended it in 1852. What does that mean again? Uh, the act of a slave owner freeing his or her slaves. Alright, so they banned slave owners from freeing slaves, which sucked for the slaves. But I guess I mean, it would. You can imagine how stuff like this can get out of control. First of all, there's a lot of slaves, and it's not easy to keep people, enslaved, because people are intelligent, and the more people you have, the more security lapses you are bound to have. And so, even back in the Roman Empire, for example, like every so often they would have a slave rebellion or a gladiator rebellion, because there's just too many slaves and you can't control that many people. It's really difficult to keep that many people in line if they don't want to be in line, right? So as the slave population increased, there's issues, and also given the number of free blacks, I mean, you would imagine that not all of them were interested in holding slaves forever. There may be a lot of abolitionists among them as well, or at least people who would maybe they would buy a slave and then kind of free them after they pay off their price or something. I mean, not everybody, people kind of not everybody's comfortable with keeping slaves, and so you can imagine that this becomes quite difficult to manage after a while. In the 1850s, white Francophones remained an intact and vibrant community. They maintained instruction in French in 2 of the city's 4 school districts. All were white. In 1860s, the city had 13,000 free peoples of color. See what I mean? Like, as these slaves come in, some of them get freed, and over time, you just get more and more and more free people of color, because they just accumulate. The class of free, mostly mixed-race people that developed during French and Spanish rule. The census recorded 81% as mulatto, a term used to cover all degrees of mixed race. Mostly part of the Francophone group, they constituted the artisan and educated and professional class of African Americans. Most blacks were still enslaved, working at the port, in domestic service, in crafts, and mostly on the many large surrounding sugarcane plantations. 13,000 free people of color, and yet there were even more who were still slaves. After growing by 45% in the 1850s, by 1860s the city had nearly 170,000 people. The city was a destination for immigrants. It had grown in wealth with a per capita income that was second in the nation and the highest in the South. So it was a major port city like New York, right? The city had a role in the primary commercial gateway, or as the primary commercial gateway for the nation's booming midsection. The port was the 3rd largest in the nation in terms of tonnage of imported goods after Boston and New York, handling 659,000 tons in 1859. Yeah, it was a major port city. As the French Creole elite feared during the Civil War, their world changed. In 1862, following the occupation by the Navy after the Battle of Fort Jackson and St. Philip, Northern forces under General Benjamin F. Butler, a respected state lawyer of the Massachusetts militia, occupied the city. Later New Orleans residents nicknamed him as Beast Butler because of a military order he issued. After his troops had been assaulted and harassed in the streets by Southern women, his order warned that future such occurrences would result in his men treating such ladies as though plying their avocation in the street, implying that they would treat the women like prostitutes. Accounts of this spread like wildfire across the South and the North. He also came to be called Spoon's Butler because of the alleged looting that his troops did while occupying New Orleans. Alright, well, war. Not that, you can excuse bad behavior, but, war is war. Butler abolished French language instructions in city schools. Statewide measures in 1864 and after the war, 1868, further strengthened English-only policy imposed by federal representatives. With the predominance of English speakers in the city and state, that language had already become dominant in businesses and government. By the end of the 19th century, French usage in the city had faded significantly. It was also under pressure from new immigrants, English speakers such as the Irish, and other Europeans such as the Italians and Germans. However, as late as 1902, 1/4 of the population of the city spoke French in ordinary daily intercourse, while another 2/4 was able to understand the language perfectly. So basically 3/4 of the population can speak fluent French. And as late as 1945, one still encountered elderly Creole women who spoke no English. The last major French language newspaper in New Orleans, the New Orleans Bee, ceased publication on December 27, 1923 after 96 years. According to some sources, Le Courrier de la Nouvelle Orleans continued until 1955. So, after the Civil War, an anti-French sort of anti-French policy was put in place, which I feel like it's probably to kind of reduce the power of the local elite and to kind of strengthen the federal influence and also influence of English speaking peoples, because I mean the Civil War in the United States was pretty ugly and a lot of people died, and the South were not too happy about how it turned out, and so in order to kind of keep people in line, I guess this is one of those things you do because you want to weaken the French speakers, because if the Southerners were allowed to just continue speaking French, I mean you risk them kind of forming a counterculture or an alternative culture to the United States, which is northern federal power, English speaking, and so it is very difficult to maintain a hold on people if they speak a different language and they have a different culture from you. So abolishing their language is one way of kind of over time diminishing their power and also diminishing their motivations for seeking independence. Which again is pretty ugly. It's a pretty ugly thing to do, to kind of just try to wipe out a culture like this. But that's kind of what you do if you want to maintain control of the city, you know what I mean? So it's pretty ugly, but again, stuff happens. As the city was captured and occupied early in the war, it was spared the destruction through warfare suffered by many other cities of the American South. The Union Army eventually extended its control north along the Mississippi River and along the coastal areas of the state. As a result, most of the southern portion of Louisiana was originally exempted from the liberating provisions of the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln. Oh, fascinating. So the Emancipation proclamation didn't really take effect, or didn't fully take effect, in New Orleans. Large numbers of rural ex-slaves and some free people of color from the city volunteered for the first regiments of black troops in the war. Led by Brigadier General Daniel Ullman of the 78th Regiment of New York State Volunteers Militia, they were known as the Corps d'Afrique, which is the African Corps. While that name had been used by a militia before the war, that group was composed of free people of color. The new group was made up mostly of former slaves. They were supplemented in the last 2 years of the war by newly organized United States colored troops, who played an increasingly important part in the war. Violence throughout the South, especially the Memphis riots of 1866 followed by the New Orleans riot in July of that year, resulted in Congress passing the Reconstruction Act and the 14th Amendment to extend the protections of full citizenship to freedmen and free people of color. Louisiana and Texas were put under the authority of the 5th Military District of the United States during the Reconstruction. Louisiana was eventually readmitted into the Union in 1868. Its Constitution of 1868 granted universal manhood suffrage and established universal public education. Both blacks and whites were elected to local and state offices. In 1872, Lieutenant Governor P.B.S. Pinchback, who was of mixed race, succeeded Henry Clay Warmouth for a brief period as Republican governor of Louisiana, becoming the first governor of African descent of an American state. The next African American to serve as governor was Douglas Wilder, elected in Virginia in 1989. For a time, New Orleans operated a racially integrated public school system. So immediately after the Civil War, or soon after the Civil War, they kind of enforced black citizenship and universal suffrage. Doesn't really say if the slaves were freed. I guess they were. Wartime damage to levees and cities along the Mississippi River adversely affected southern crops and trade for the port city for some time. The federal government contributed to restoring infrastructure, but it took time. The nationwide financial recession and panic of 1873 also adversely affected businesses and slowed economic recovery. From 1868, elections in Louisiana were marked by violence as white insurgents tried to suppress black voting and disrupt Republican gatherings. Violence continued around elections. The disputed 1872 gubernatorial election resulted in conflicts that ran for years. The White League, an insurgent paramilitary group that supported the Democratic Party, was organized in 1874 and operated in the open, violently suppressing the black vote and running off Republican office holders. In 1874, in the Battle of Liberty Place, 5,000 members of the White League fought with city police to take over the state offices for the Democratic candidate for governor, holding them for 3 days. By 1876, such tactics resulted in the white Democrats, the so-called Redeemers, regaining political control of the state legislature. The federal government gave up and withdrew its troops in 1877, ending Reconstruction. Wow! The white people managed to beat back the federal government. That's incredible. Racism. I guess they were motivated. That's amazing. Amazingly bad. While Democrats passed Jim Crow laws establishing racial segregation in public facilities, white Democrats passed Jim Crow laws. In 1889, the legislature passed a constitutional amendment incorporating a grandfather clause that effectively disenfranchised freedmen as well as the propertied people of color free before the war. Unable to vote, African Americans could not serve on juries or in local office and were closed out of formal politics for several generations in the state. It was ruled by a white Democratic Party. Public schools were racially segregated and remained so until 1960. That is so incredibly backwards and bad. They disenfranchised. Not only did they kind of... Basically, they removed the citizenship or they effectively removed the citizenship of black people. And even the freed black people from before the war were disenfranchised. Crazy. New Orleans' large community of well-educated, often French-speaking free persons of color who had been free prior to the Civil War sought to fight back against Jim Crow. They organized the Citizens Committee to work for civil rights. As part of their legal campaign, they recruited one of their own, Homer Plessy, to test whether Louisiana's newly enacted Separate Car Act was constitutional. Plessy boarded a commuter train departing New Orleans for Covington, Louisiana, sat in the car reserved for whites only, and was arrested. The case resulting from this incident, Plessy versus Ferguson, was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. The court ruled that separate but equal accommodations were constitutional, effectively upholding Jim Crow measures. Terrible! In practice, African American public schools and facilities were underfunded in Louisiana and across the South. The Supreme Court ruling contributed to this period as the nadir of race relations in the United States. The rate of lynchings of black men was high across the South, as other states also disenfranchised blacks and sought to impose Jim Crow to establish white supremacy. Throughout New Orleans history until the early 20th century, when medical and scientific advances ameliorated the situation, the city suffered repeated epidemics of yellow fever and other tropical and infectious diseases. I don't know if we need to read any more. I mean, actually, it's quite important historically. It's not that important for the game. No. It's important historically because there was slaves, and then there was the emancipation, and then there was Jim Crow, which really pushed back against the civil rights of colored people for many decades. Alright, 20th century, New Orleans' zenith as an economic and population center in relation to other American cities occurred in the decades prior to 1860. But I mean, notice all this though, like the Jim Crow stuff and the re-establishment of segregation and racism. I mean, yeah, all that took place, but the power and the wealth of the city was in irreversible decline, right? I mean, the races kind of putting white people back in power didn't allow the city to recover. The city just I mean, at one point it was the third most important port in the city in the country after Boston and New York. But once but from the end of the Civil War onwards, it just kind of declined and declined and declined. And Jim Crow didn't change that trend. I mean, I'm not an expert on the history of the South, but I just want to make a point here that I mean the slavery worked at the time. It would like New Orleans was a major port city because of the slave trade and the industry that was enabled by the slavery. And then there was the Civil War. And then the blacks were freed, given the rights, and then the rights taken back away from them. But the economy never came back. The industry never came back. So I don't know what to conclude, to be honest. I just want to kind of think about that. Anyway, let's continue reading. At this time, New Orleans was the nation's fifth largest city and was significantly larger than all other American South population centers. New Orleans continued to increase in population from the mid-19th century onwards, but rapid economic growth shifted to other areas of the country, meaning that New Orleans' relative importance steadily declined. First to emerge in importance were the new industrial and railroad hubs of the Midwest, then the rapidly growing metropolises of the Pacific Coast. In the decades before and after the turn of the 20th century, in the post-World War II period, other Sunbelt cities in the South and West surpassed New Orleans in population. Construction of railways and highways decreased river traffic, diverting goods to other transportation corridors and markets. Thousands of the most ambitious blacks left New Orleans and the state in the Great Migration around World War II and after, many for West Coast destinations. See, that kind of, well, I mean, that explains everything. First of all, the use of railroads meant that the using the Mississippi River to transport goods was not as important anymore. And secondly, with the racism and everything, the ambitious blacks, or the blacks who were educated and who had had kind of skills and the abilities and were employable, they wouldn't stay around here because they were being discriminated against. So they all left. And I would guess that even the white people who didn't agree with the racism would have left as well. So you have a whole bunch of smart people and skilled people leaving this place because of how negative the Jim Crow was, right? I mean, personally, if I had a choice, imagine if I imagine kind of living in that place at that time, I would leave too. I would leave too. Like, it was. I don't want to be in a place that's kind of that's so incredibly racist. I don't want to be there. So, it's it wasn't a strategy it wasn't a successful strategy in terms of prosperity. It kept the whites in power for many decades afterwards, but it didn't actually do them very much good because all the money is gone. Anyway, from the late 1800s, most U.S. censuses recorded New Orleans slipping rank among American cities. Reminded every 10 years of its declining relative importance, New Orleans would periodically mount attempts to regain its economic vigor and preeminence, with varying degrees of success. By the mid-20th century, New Orleanians recognized that the city was being surpassed as a leading urban area in the South. By 1950, Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta exceeded New Orleans in size, and in 1960, Miami eclipsed New Orleans, even as the latter's population reached what would be its historic peak that year. As with other older American cities in the post-war period, highway construction and suburban development drew residents from the center city to newer housing outside. The 1970s census recorded the first absolute decline in the city's population since it joined the United States. The New Orleans metropolitan area continued expanding in population, however, just not as rapidly as other major cities in the Sun Belt. While the port remained one of the largest in the nation, automation and containerization resulted in significant job losses. The city's relative fall in stature meant that its former role as banker to the south was inexorably supplanted by competing companies in larger peer cities. New Orleans' economy had always been based more on trade and financial services than on manufacturing, but the city's relatively small manufacturing sector also shrank in the post-World War II period. Despite some economic development successes under the administration of de Lesseps, Chep Morrison, and Victor Vic Shiro, metropolitan New Orleans' growth rate consistently lagged behind more vigorous cities. The civil rights movement during the later years of Morrison's administration and for the entirety of Shiro's, the city was the center of the civil rights struggle. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded in the city, lunch counter sit-ins were held in Canal Street stores, and a prominent and violent series of confrontations occurred in 1960 when the city attempted school desegregation, following the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education 1954, when 6-year-old Ruby Bridges integrated William Frantz Elementary School in the city's 9th ward. She was the first child of color to attend a previously all-white school in the South. The civil rights movement's successes in gaining federal passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided enforcement of constitutional rights, including voting for blacks. Together, these resulted in the most far-reaching changes in New Orleans' 20th century history. Though legal and civil equality were re-established by the end of the 1960s, a large gap in income levels and education attainment persisted between the city's white and African American communities. As the middle class and wealthier members of both races left the center city, its population income level dropped, and it became proportionally more African American. From 1980, the African American majority has elected officials from its own community. They have struggled to narrow the gap by creating conditions conducive to the economic uplift of the African American community. New Orleans became increasingly dependent on tourism as an economic mainstay by the administrations of Sidney Barthélemy and Marc Moriel. Relatively low levels of educational attainment, high rates of household poverty, and rising crime threatened the prosperity of the city in the later decades of the century. The negative effects of these socio-economic conditions contrasted with the changes to the economy of the United States, which were based on a post-industrial, knowledge-based paradigm where mental skills and education were far more important to advancement than manual skills. Drainage and flood control. I think I'm going to end there. And then Hurricane Katrina. But you can look that up yourself if you don't remember that debacle. Actually, post-disaster recovery. Because of the scale of damage, many people settled permanently outside the city in other areas where they had evacuated, as in Houston. So Katrina didn't help. In fact, Katrina pushed even more people away from the city. That's insane. Most recently, 2010 estimates show that neighborhoods that did not flood are near 100% of their pre-Katrina populations, and in some cases exceed 100% of their pre-Katrina populations. Well, I mean, it's still doing pretty poorly. Hurricanes not helping. Alright, so geography. New Orleans is located there, on the banks of the Mississippi River, approximately 105 miles upriver from the Gulf of Mexico. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the city has a total area of 350 square miles, of which 169 square miles is land and 181 square miles is water. Orleans Parish is the smallest parish by land area in Louisiana. The city is located in the Mississippi River Delta on the east and west banks of the Mississippi River and south of Lake Pontchartrain. Is that Native American? Am I pronouncing that wrong? The area along the river is characterized by ridges and hollows. Well, I mean, in the game, the city is just flat. New Orleans was originally settled on the natural levees or high ground along the Mississippi River. After the flood, I don't think we need to read that. It's not really in the game, but if you want to read about how the city is sinking, you can read all of it. It's quite important for New Orleans, but I'm not going to read it right now. But the city is sinking, which is terrible. In fact, maybe the city should just move, because it was on a bad location to begin with. I mean, it was good for trade as a port city, but the geography is really bad because it was built on sediments, right? And naturally, the river would change course. Like rivers don't stay still. Like every so often, they would kind of slowly move as the sediment kind of piles up, and so it was kind of in a bad place. It was a bad place to put a city because it's at the mouth of a river. Anyway, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read the cityscape though. The Central Business District of New Orleans is located immediately south and west of the Mississippi River and was historically called the American Quarter or American Sector. It was developed after the heart of French and Spanish settlement. It includes Lafayette Square. Most streets in this area fan out from the central point of the city. Major streets of the area include Canal Street, Poydras Street, Tulane Avenue, and Loyola Avenue. Canal Street functions as the street which divides the traditional downtown area from the uptown area. Let me just look at a map. So this is talking about this area here. So you see how the streets fan out from the middle. Where's Canal Street? Canal Street is there. So I believe the city, they're talking about this point here. But the French Quarter is where the game takes place. Let me see if we can read about that. Cityscape, why does it talk about the Central Business District first? Alright, maybe I should just go to the French Quarter. It's got its own article. New Orleans is world famous for its abundance of unique architectural styles, which reflect the city's historical roots and multicultural heritage. Though New Orleans possesses numerous structures of national architectural significance, it is equally, if not more, revered for its enormous, largely intact, even post-Katrina, historic built environment. 20 National Register historic districts have been established, and 14 local historic districts aid in the preservation of this tant ensemble. Ensemble. Is it how do you pronounce that? It's French, right? Anyway, 13 of the local historic districts are administered by the New Orleans Historic District Landmarks Commission. I don't really know that. French. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's not really focusing on the things we can see in the game. Climate. New Orleans got many distinctive neighborhoods. All right, I think we're gonna jump over to what's in Louis Catholic Cathedral. Is this thing we're standing in front of in the game? Shrinking population, economy. All right, we're gonna skip all this stuff. Ooh, culture and contemporary life. Maybe we should read this. Culture and contemporary life. New Orleans has many. Actually, no, maybe I've missed. We're gonna skip to the French Quarter because this is the quarter that we can play in the game. Although even here, it's only a little part of it that we can play. The French Quarter is the oldest neighborhood in the city of New Orleans. After New Orleans was founded in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste de Lamonnois de Bienville, the city developed around the Old Square, a central square. The district is more commonly called the French Quarter today, or simply the Quarter, related to changes in the city with American immigration after the Louisiana Purchase. Most of the present-day historic buildings were constructed during the late 18th century during the city's period of Spanish rule and reflect Spanish colonial architecture. The district as a whole has been designated as a National Historic Landmark with numerous contributing buildings that are separately deemed significant. It is a prime tourist destination in the city as well as attracting loyal residents. Because of its distance from areas where the levee was breached during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it suffered relatively light damage as compared to other areas of the city and the greater region. Well, that's good. Geography, boundaries, don't really need to read all that. Demographics, history. Many of the buildings date from 1803 when New Orleans was acquired by the United States in the Louisiana Purchase, although some late 19th century and early 20th century buildings were added to the area. Since the 1920s, the historic buildings have been protected by law and cannot be demolished, and any renovations or new construction in the neighborhood must be done according to city regulations to preserve the period historic architectural style. Most of the French Quarter's architecture was built during the late 18th century and the period of Spanish rule over the city, which is reflected in the architecture of the neighborhood. The Great New Orleans Fire in 1788, which has not taken place yet in the game, and another Great Fire in 1794 destroyed most of the quarter's old French colonial architecture. Well, that sucks. So that's why all the Spanish stuff remains and not the French stuff, because fire. Now, leaving the colony's new Spanish overlords to rebuild it according to more modern tastes. Their strict new fire codes mandated that all structures be physically adjacent and close to the curb to create a firewall. The exception to that rule, the Cornstalk Hotel, was also listed on the National Historic Register, still stands today at 915 Royal Street and is the most photographed hotel in the French Quarter. The old French peaked roofs were replaced with flat tiled ones, and wooden siding was banned in favor of fire-resistant stucco. Painted in the pastel hues fashionable at the time, as a result, colorful walls and roofs and elaborately decorated ironwork balconies and galleries from the late 18th and the early 19th centuries abound. In southeast Louisiana, a distinction is made between balconies, which are self-supporting and attached to the side of the house, and galleries, which are supported from the ground by poles or columns. Alright. So, okay, I see. So the French Quarter that exists today is architecturally Spanish, with flat roofs and stucco walls that are painted in bright colors because of the fire burning down the French Quarter. But if we just look around, oh, it's nighttime. if you just look around right now, we see, okay, so this sort of thing here, see stucco and flat roofs, I believe. Let me just climb up here. So this roof, actually no, this is a sloping roof. So there's a few flat roofs, see the flat roof there, but mostly the sloping roofs, which is more French in character. We don't see wooden sidings very much though. Let me just run around a little bit. There's more timber siding to the north. So this stuff here, this stuff here, timber stuff. That's apparently what the French architecture was like. So like this stuff here, like wooden sidings. But most of it burnt down in the fires. And so what you see today is quite a bit more Spanish. Alright, let's continue reading. When Anglophone Americans began to move in after the Louisiana Purchase, they mostly built on available land upriver across modern-day Canal Street. This thoroughfare became the meeting place of two cultures, one Francophone Creole and the other Anglophone American. Local landowners had retained architect and surveyor Barthélemy Lafon to subdivide the property to create an American suburb. The median of the wide boulevard became a place where the two contentious cultures could meet and do business in both French and English. As such, it became known as the neutral ground, and this name is used for medians in the New Orleans area. Yeah, so as we can we get on the map. So as we see here, like the French-speaking people and the English-speaking people, they didn't really mix very well. So going back to why during the Reconstruction era, why the federal government kind of imposed English and like English education and kind of pushed out the French-speaking people because of this kind of cultural clash. Because as long as you speak different languages, you maintain very distinct and different cultures. Even before the Civil War, French Creoles had become a minority in the French Quarter. In the late 19th century, the Quarter became a less fashionable part of town, and many immigrants from southern Italy and Ireland settled there. In 1905, the Italian consul estimated that one-third to one-half of the Quarter's population were Italian-born or second-generation Italian Americans. Irish immigrants also settled heavily in the Esplante area, which was called the Irish Channel. In 1917, the closure of the Storyville sent much of the vice formerly concentrated therein back into the French Quarter, which for most of the remaining French Creole families, this was the last straw, and they began to move uptown. This, combined with the loss of the French Opera House 2 years later, provided a bookend to the era of French Creole culture in the Quarter. Many of the remaining French Creoles moved to the university area. Alright, so after many years of neglect and crime, eventually the French Quarter was abandoned by respectable people. In the early 20th century, the Quarter's cheap rents and an air of decay attracted a bohemian artistic community, a trend which became pronounced in the 1920s. Many of these new inhabitants were active in the first preservation efforts in the Quarter, which began around that time. As a result, the French Quarter Commission, the Vauquerie Commission, VCC, was established in 1925. Although initially only an advisory body, a 1936 referendum to amend the Louisiana Constitution afforded it a measure of regulatory power. It began to exercise more power in the 1940s to preserve and protect the district. Meanwhile, World War II brought thousands of servicemen and war workers to New Orleans, as well as the surrounding regions, military bases, and shipyards. Many of these sojourners paid visits to the Vauquerie. Is it Vauquerie? Is it silent E? Am I mangling this? Is it Vauquerie? Although nightlife and vice had already begun to coalesce on Bourbon Street in the 2 decades following the closure of Storyville, the war produced a larger, more permanent presence of exotic, risque, and often raucous entertainment on what became the city's most famous strip. Years of repeated crackdowns on vice in Bourbon Street clubs, which took on new urgency under Mayor de Lesseps Story Morrison, reached a crescendo with District Attorney Jim Garrison's raids in 1962, but Bourbon Street's clubs were soon back in business. You can't stop the clubs. The plan to construct an elevated riverfront expressway between the Mississippi River levee and the French Quarter consumed the attention of Vauquer. No, the E has an accent on it. It can't be silent. The Vauquer preservationists through much of the 1960s. On December 21st, 1965, the Vauquer Historic District was designated a National Historic Landmark. After waging a decade-long battle against the Vauquer Riverfront Expressway that utilized the newly passed National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, preservationists and their allies forced the issue into federal court, eventually producing the cancellation of the freeway plan in 1969. So, what happened with the freeway construction is sometimes planners or politicians would try to use freeway construction as a pretext to demolish neighborhoods they don't like, and that happened quite a bit in the United States. But here, the preservationists managed to get the area designated as a historic area, and so that gave it enough protection to stop the expressway from going through the middle of the French Quarter, which is good because the French Quarter is pretty awesome, and you should not demolish it. The victory was important for the preservation of the French Quarter, but it was hardly the only challenge. Throughout the 1960s, new hotels opened regularly, often replacing large sections of the French Quarter. The VCC approved these structures as long as their designs adhered to prevailing exterior styles. Detractors, fearing that the Vauquer's charm might be compromised by the introduction of too many new inns, lobbied successfully for passage in 1969 of a municipal ordinance that forbade new hotels within the district's boundaries. However, the ordinance failed to stop the proliferation of timeshare condominiums and clandestine bed and breakfast inns throughout the French Quarter or high-rise hotels just outside its boundaries. In the 1980s, many long-term residents were driven away by rising rents as property values rose dramatically with expectations of windfalls from the planned 1984 World Fair site nearby. More of the neighborhood was developed to support tourism, which is important to the city's economy. But the French Quarter still combines residential, hotels, guest houses, bars, restaurants, and tourist-oriented commercial properties. Well, I mean, if you have a historic center, it's kind of inevitable that it becomes a tourist trap, and therefore hotels will get built. I mean, you can't both have it a protected historic center and also not a tourist site, right? I mean, you can't have both. I mean, if you have historic architecture, there's going to be tourism. Um, right. So we're not going to read about Hurricane Katrina that much. Landmark attractions. There's Jackson Square, which is the square where we're in now, and then there's other things. All right. So we're gonna look at the buildings soon enough. Oh, actually, I haven't read the in-game description of the city yet. Well, where is it? So Jackson Square is this square here, I believe. I'm fairly sure that this is Jackson Square, unless I'm wrong. Alright, so what does the game have to say about Jackson Square? Database, locations, or no, not New Orleans. Does it say anything about the city itself? No, it doesn't. Alright, well, so that's our, I guess, a bit of background on New Orleans and the French Quarter. The history is fascinating. I mean, there were slaves, there was money, there were a lot of free black people as well, and then there was the Civil War, and then there was Reconstruction, and then there was Jim Crow, and then there was the Civil Rights Movement. But it just kind of declined and declined and declined. I guess it wasn't. There was also the other issue, which is even though slavery, ended, or slavery, the end of slavery was kind of forced by the Civil War. But even so, as as technology progressed and things became more and more mechanized, I mean, slavery, it made sense at that time because human labor was worth money, right? Because I mean, you needed people to pick cotton. I mean, that's basically it. You needed people, you needed humans to pick cotton. But as technology advances, you can you can make more money using the land for other things and using machines, right? Because like farming and agriculture today don't use as much human labor anymore. Like you use tractors and you use kind of machinery, and so you can grow other things using machines, and it's less expensive and less of a hassle to manage than slaves. Slaves are, I mean, they were economical at the time, but if you think about it, you have to keep thousands of people like alive and healthy enough to work for you. It actually costs a lot of money to run a slave plantation. And so, with mechanization and with the invention of machines, it's inevitable that the slave economy would collapse at some point. I mean, I feel like, you know, as long as, even if the Civil War didn't happen in quite the same way, it's still, I mean, one way or another, the slave economy would have had to end because once you have machines and tractors, then the humans are not worth as much. I mean, like keeping a few machines is cheaper than keeping thousands of people, and the people they're worth more free anyway because every person, if you educate them, they're they can do intelligent work. They can do, I don't know, accounting, or they can kind of do engineering. Because like if you educate someone, they're worth a lot more than if you don't educate someone. So just from an economic point of view, I don't think the slavery would really last much longer anyway. And so the Jim Crow thing, which is just, I mean, if you just kind of think about it, it really makes no good sense, because you had these freed slaves, which at the end of the Civil War they were freed, and there was the equal and integrated education systems, and if you just kind of continue on that track, the black people would, after a generation or two, become sufficiently educated to work in skilled labor, not unskilled manual labor, which the slaves are doing, but skilled labor and professional labor, and then the whole, like, and that would help the economy of the area, because again, like, skilled labor is worth more than unskilled labor. But the Jim Crow trying to revert to the conditions that they had under slavery, like kind of cutting the blacks off from education and from voting and from politics and from anything good. And yet slaves didn't work anymore. Like, the slavery was kind of pointless now. So slavery was pointless with, now that they had machines, slavery was pointless. But they tried to go back to those conditions under which slavery occurred, and so it just didn't work. It was just a bad idea. Why? Like, why do you need to hold down the black people? Because you don't need people to pick cotton. Like, you don't need slave labor because like, they're worth more as skilled labor. So from a purely economical point of view, the Jim Crow was just a really bad idea. And of course, there were the railways, which made the ports less important, and other things. And so the city just declined and declined and declined because the world had changed, technology had changed, the economy had changed. But they kept trying to maintain the old racist model of society, but the whole world had changed around them, and it didn't make any sense anymore. Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting about that now. Uh, in the next video, we start looking at the buildings. There's not that many buildings in the game, but we'll look at all of them, and then I'll see you in the next video.